Hello, everyone. Welcome to another brief lecture for Phil 115, Critical Thinking. This is chapter 12 on fallacies and persuaders. So as a quick introduction to this chapter, this is usually the most popular chapter that we'll cover, not because the other chapters aren't important, but rather because most of the things that we want to talk about in this chapter are things that many of us or most of us might already be familiar with. And that's fallacious reasoning or errors in reasoning. And fallacies are everywhere. They are especially pernicious online and in politics and even in everyday conversations. So it's really critical that we talk about some of the most common fallacies in order to be more effective critical thinkers and hopefully to change the nature of political discourse, at least in this country, and hopefully, again, make us sharper critical thinkers. So by way of introduction, let's say that a fallacy is, at its most basic level, an error of reasoning. Fallacious reasoning takes the place of good argumentation. Fallacious reasoning is everywhere. Usually fallacies are employed unknowingly, but often fallacies are used intentionally because fallacious reasoning is and can be very effective. As I mentioned, our goal is to spot fallacious reasoning and identify the sort of fallacy employed. So fallacies, as we might have seen in the chapter, can be broken down into different categories and types. And so one distinction that might help us, especially given what we've learned in the previous chapters, are things like formal fallacies, which are essentially invalid deductive arguments. So a formal fallacy is an error of reasoning or a bad or defective argument, and we can identify those merely by examining the form or structure of the argument. So we should already be familiar with some of this reasoning. So if we had a deductive argument that had this form, all A's are B's, all C's are B's, therefore all A's are C's, no matter what I plug in for A, B, and C, I'm going to get an invalid argument. Or this one, which we should already be familiar with, this is affirming the consequent, right? If Anthony is a father, then he's a man. Anthony is a man, therefore he's a father. That's always invalid, no matter what I plug in there. So the reason we call these formal fallacies is because we know they're fallacious just by looking at the form or structure. More commonly understood fallacies are called informal fallacies, and these can be detected only by examining the content of the argument. So hopefully you're seeing the difference between a formal fallacy and an informal one. So if we take this example of a fallacy we're going to talk about in just a second, it has nothing to do with the structure, but rather the content and how the content is being used. So if we said the Brooklyn Bridge is made of atoms, atoms are invisible, therefore the Brooklyn Bridge is invisible. There's something wrong with the content of this argument, not so much the structure or form. Okay, so the chapter categorizes fallacies and persuaders, or what we're going to call rhetorical devices, into three different categories. So the first category are fallacies that have irrelevant premises. The second category is fallacies that have unacceptable premises. And the third category are these rhetorical devices, or what are sometimes called persuaders. These are not technically fallacies, but rather linguistic tools that people use to get somebody else to accept a certain position or mock somebody, or some other tactic is employed that I'm sure you'll find familiar if you've looked at online discussions or, as I said earlier, political discourse. Okay, so let's talk about category one, fallacies. I'm going to try to go through these examples rather quickly. Some of these will be familiar to you, but since there are a number of them listed in the chapter, I want to keep this on the shorter side. So the category one fallacies are the fallacies with irrelevant premises or premise. So one of the reasons we call it irrelevant, a fallacy of relevance or irrelevance, is that people often present arguments as if the conclusion followed from the premises, even though they don't, right? or they're irrelevant to the establishment of the conclusion. That doesn't mean, though, that importantly, this is why I have this, it doesn't mean that it can't be psychologically relevant. Of course, people form patterns, and one of the reasons fallacies are so often used is because they're effective, right? So we're making this distinction between logos and pathos again. Critical thinking and logic is about good argumentation, not good persuasion or rhetoric. That's a different topic, right? That's for communication studies and speech. We're here talking about the nature and structure of arguments. And so we want to separate a good argument from a persuasive argument, right? Those two do not always overlap. Okay, so the first one that the chapter mentions is what's called the genetic fallacy. I have some pictures here just to keep these on the lighter side. This is Teddy Roosevelt, a former American president from the early 20th century. And I have him in this example coming up. So the genetic fallacy is the kind of reasoning that we use where we argue that a claim is true or false solely because of its origin. Okay, so let's say somebody said, we should reject that proposal for solving the current welfare mess. It comes straight from the Bull Moose Party, which is a party that Teddy Roosevelt formed after he got, how should we say, displaced from at that time, the Republican Party. So we often do this when we just accept or reject a claim because we like or don't like the source. But of course, a claim's truth or falsity has nothing to do, technically speaking, with the source. Good sources can make false claims, and bad sources can make true claims, right? The truth or falsity of a claim does not depend on the origin. So when we reject something from a news source we don't like, or a person we don't like, that's going to be a little bit more of an ad hominem. But if it comes from a source or origin that we either like or don't like, that has nothing to do with the truth or falsity of the claim. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't care about sources. We most definitely should. But again, the source does not determine the truth of the claim. The claim should be true or false independently of the source making it. So this is what we call the genetic fallacy. The fallacy of composition is something that occurs in slightly different forms, but it's usually arguing that what's true of the parts must be true of the whole. So a silly, simple example would be something like the atoms that make up the human body are invisible, therefore the human body is invisible. People do this all the time in, I think, other contexts where they think that what's true of some things must be true of that whole group. And that kind of reasoning can often get us into trouble. I have other examples that come to mind, but again, I don't want to prolong the lecture any longer. But this is the fallacy where we argue that what's true of the parts must be true of the whole, which is not good reasoning. Here's another simple example. The parts of Anthony's bike are pretty cheap, so his bike must be pretty cheap. So just because the individual parts aren't expensive doesn't mean that the overall bike isn't expensive, right? Fallacy of division just goes in the opposite direction. This is arguing that what is true of the whole must be true of the constituent parts. So this bicycle is heavy, therefore all the parts of this bicycle are heavy. That's obviously not good reasoning. Here's a good example from a classroom situation. If I said the class did well overall on the exam, right? So let's say the median or mean score on the midterm exam is in the mid to high 80s, it doesn't follow then that every student must have done well, right? That's arguing that what's true of the whole must be true of the parts. That obviously does not follow. I think the most common fallacy is clearly the appeal to the person, oftentimes referred to as ad hominem, which is Latin for against man, against the man. This is when we reject a claim by criticizing the person who makes it rather than the claim itself. I mean, this is social media 101, right? Where we just attack people instead of their ideas, right? So if for example, we saw something like, we should reject Anthony's argument for free tuition at public schools. Let's say I made that argument and then you just reject that out of hand because I'm Italian and can't be trusted. I mean, you're just attacking me, right? Or you're calling my hat stupid, right? That's clearly not good reasoning, and doesn't mean that it's not used. It's obviously used quite often. The appeal to the person fallacy comes in a couple different varieties. So the personal attack, which is in the example here. There's also called the circumstantial ad hominem, which we'll talk about in a second. The inconsistency ad hominem, the tu quoque, and also whataboutism, which is a very, very common form of the tu quoque ad hominem fallacy, and also poisoning the well, which we'll talk about in turn. Okay, so the circumstantial ad hominem is used quite frequently. This is the kind of ad hominem we use when we reject someone's claim, given that that person's circumstances, or because we expect that person to make it. So here's a simple example. Take my colleague, Rebeka Ferreira, who's a philosophy instructor at Green River. So let's say she argues that women should receive equal pay for equal work. But then let's say we rejected that argument because we say, oh, well, of course she would say that, she's a woman. Well, I mean, that might be true, but that doesn't make the claim or argument less convincing simply because she's a woman, right? People do this all the time where we say, oh, well, of course you would say that. We expect you to, right? And thus we dismiss or downplay the argument or claim in question because of the circumstances. But right, the claim that women should receive equal pay is no less diminished given the fact that Professor Ferreira is herself a woman, right? We do this kind of reasoning all the time, not good reasoning. So that would be an instance of circumstantial ad hominem. Or we could use it in politics, right? Juan Guaido's from Venezuela argues that Nicolas Maduro should be removed from office in Venezuela, but he's just saying that because he wants to be in power, so his arguments are uncogent. Now, it could very well be true that Guaido wants to remove Maduro, but there could be, again, good independent reasons for someone being replaced that don't have to do with their personal motivations. Not to say that those aren't important, they could be, but again, the truth or falsity of a claim is independent of a person making it. Just like arguments, as we've been saying the last few weeks, are either valid, invalid, sound, unsound, cogent, uncogent, independently of who makes them, right? We can judge the arguments based on the arguments themselves. And we become fallacious when we don't do that, when we attack the source or the person or things like that. So hopefully you're getting that impression thus far. We could also see an instance of the circumstantial ad hominem from like a salesperson, right? Naturally, we're skeptical of people who try to sell us stuff, but they could be giving us the truth, and we can't just dismiss what they say out of hand just because we expect them to make it. So if I'm buying a car and this person says, according to the US Department of Transportation, this one gets better gas mileage. And then I say, well, that's false. You just want to sell me the car. Well, the salesperson could be trying to sell me the car, but that doesn't mean that the claim about fuel economy is false. So this would be another instance of circumstantial ad hominem. Okay, here's one of the more common fallacies as well, called the tu quoque, or which is Latin for you're another. Sometimes it might just be easier to refer to this as the hypocrite fallacy. This is when we reject a claim by criticizing the person because their view is perceived as hypocritical, or that the claimant doesn't live by or practice in accordance with the claim in question. Very, very common. So here's an example. Let's say I make an argument that you should not smoke cigarettes, and then I give you some medical evidence, and I give all kinds of charts and graphs, but then at the end of my presentation, you just reject everything I say because I've smoked cigarettes myself in the past, which is true when I was in undergraduate. Not that I'm especially proud of that, but just because I smoked doesn't mean that the argument against smoking is not good. Of course it is. So just because you perceive me as being hypocritical does not mean that the strength of the argument that I'm giving is less persuasive, right? So we often do this where we love to hold people up as hypocrites. And it's not that we shouldn't care about people being hypocritical. We should. But being hypocritical does not affect the strength of the argument, right? It might diminish our psychological feelings for some person or individual organization or whatever, but we often conflate the argument with the person making it, and that can lead us into some bad reasoning. So this is a very pernicious form of ad hominem. Another kind of we have to mention that's crept up in politics increasingly over the years is this move similar to tu quoque called whataboutism, where someone will bring up an issue that they want to address or make an accusation or a charge against someone, but then they bring up, well, what about so-and-so? That diverts attention away from the original person in question. So this is usually, this occurs in politics on both sides, but we've seen it especially used in the last few years, I have to say. And I think this is a really good example with Hillary Clinton, former presidential candidate. So let's say, I bring up a worry about former President Trump inciting a mob riot on the Capitol building. Right? I'm worried about that. And then somebody says, well, what about Hillary's emails? I didn't see your outrage over that. Well, that could be something that needs to be looked into, and it has. But that's not the topic in question here. The topic in question here is the president's actions. So simply invoking some other person does not absolve the person in question of wrongdoing or from judgment, right? So people do this all the time, where somebody is, being confronted about something or being accused of something, and then somebody just says, oh, well, what about this other person, right? That's called whataboutism, and it's especially pernicious in politics. Another form of ad hominem, which is, again, common in politics, is called poisoning the well. This is usually used in advance when somebody is about to take the stage or about to talk, and you kind of taint the water so that anything they say is probably going to be dismissed or regarded with some degree of skepticism. So it'd be something like, before my opponent speaks, let me remind the audience that they have no regard for the truth. So then if, somebody came up to the stage following what I just said, the audience is going to think that the well is poisoned, that they can't trust anything that comes out of it, right? So this is a very common tactic in political debates, and especially online. So this is a common one. All right, equivocation, maybe a less common one, but still used. This fallacy occurs when the conclusion of an argument depends on the fact that a word or phrase is used either explicitly or implicitly in two different senses in the same argument. So here's an example. Only man is rational, no woman is a man, therefore no woman is rational. So why is this problematic? I mean, more than one reason, but I'm using man in two different senses. I'm using man to refer to sex, and I'm also using man to refer to humans, mankind, right? So I'm equivocating between man in premise 1 and premise 2, right? How about this? Any law can be repealed. Gravity is a law, so it too can be repealed. Well, I'm equivocating law, right? In one sense, I'm using law as a legal code, and in another sense, I'm using law as a scientific law of nature. So that would be committing the fallacy of equivocation. Okay, this is a very common one, appeal to the masses, sometimes referred to as appeal to popularity. This is where we argue that a claim or argument or something must be true merely because a substantial number of people believe it. But hopefully, as we've seen, especially the last few years, just because a lot of people believe in something doesn't make it true. I'm thinking of QAnon conspiracies. I'm thinking of the flat earth conspiracy. I'm thinking of, take your pick. There's a lot of views out there that a lot of people seem to believe in, but just because a lot of people believe in it doesn't make it true, okay? So it could be about political things, like where we say, of course, this war is justified. Everyone believes that it's justified. Well, that doesn't establish anything, right? That just means that a large number of people believe it. Okay, so we need to really be on high alert for appeals to the masses, right? Just because a lot of people believe in something does not make it true, right? We should be able to independently establish the truth of any claim or assess the validity or strength of any argument independently of how popular it is, right? And oftentimes, the most popular arguments or views aren't necessarily the correct ones, right? Or I should rephrase, or backed up by strong evidence, right? I mean, lots of people might believe in Bigfoot, right? Or lots of people might believe that, you know, Barack Obama is an alien lizard. Doesn't make it true, okay? So we really need to be on alert, high alert for this use of reasoning. People often do this as well with the infamous appeal to tradition. So maybe this might remind you of parents. Parents tend to do this where they say, well, this is the way it's always been. This is the fallacy where we argue that a claim must be true just because it's part of some tradition or it's been used for a long time, right? So an example would be something like, well, astrological predictions have been used for thousands of years. They must be true. Or horoscopes have been viewed for thousands of years. Obviously, there must be some truth to it. No, right? Not necessarily. Just because something has been a part of a tradition doesn't make it true. It could just mean that we've gotten used to it. This isn't to say that traditions aren't important. Of course, traditions are important. But just because something has been a tradition doesn't mean it should continue to be a tradition. There are lots of traditions that I'm sure we can think of that have very serious and have had very serious consequences that we no longer partake in, right? For good reasons. So just because it's been a tradition doesn't mean that it should continue to be one. All right, another common fallacy is the appeal to ignorance. This is very, very commonly used with conspiracy theorists, where people argue that a lack of evidence proves something. So if we're using ghosts as an example, we might argue something like, no one has shown that ghosts aren't real, so they must be real, right? So you're arguing that because of a lack of evidence proves that they don't exist, therefore they do exist, right? And that's not good reasoning for hopefully obvious reasons. It could also go in reverse, right? No one has shown that ghosts are real, so they must not exist, right? We have to be careful about it going the other way. But really, really importantly, we assume, this is especially crucial for those of you going into criminal justice fields or legal fields, the burden of proof should always be on the arguer making a positive argument for something. So you're free to argue for Hollywood lizard people or the earth being flat or ghosts or Bigfoot or whatever. Of course, you're free to do that, but the burden is on you to produce the evidence to support that claim, right? We can't argue that, well, because you haven't disproved my view must be correct. That's not how courtrooms work. That's not how law enforcement works. That's not how philosophy or science or mathematics work, right? The burden of proof is on the person making the argument for something. So if you're going to argue for whatever, Bigfoot, you got to produce evidence for Bigfoot, right? The burden of proof is on you to produce it. Another common fallacy is the appeal to emotion. We use this all the time, right? The use of emotions as premises in an argument. So if I said, you should hire for me for this job, if I don't get a job, my wife's going to leave me and I'm not going to have money for stuff, give me a break. Now, look, no one is saying that emotion isn't important and that we shouldn't be empathetic. The worry, though, is that when emotion is the only reason that, is being used to justify something, or in this case, hire me, mostly we want to think that I should get the job if I'm qualified, right? If I have the proper qualifications. But if I just rely on emotion, then we are getting into the fallacious example of appeal to emotion, right? And there's a couple varieties of this, as the book mentions. Appeals to pity, right? Like this example, getting another to accept a conclusion by invoking pity, compassion, or empathy. Again, all these things are good, but they can't be the only reason that we accept a claim, right? Apple polishing, this is where we get people to accept a conclusion by flattering them, right? So if you came to my office, post-pandemic, and you said, I need this grade in this class. Oh, have I told you how nice your office is, professor, right? That would be clearly apple polishing. Scare tactics, right? Accept this conclusion or else, right? People often will threaten violence, unfortunately, to get people to accept something. So these are all instances of fallacious reasoning. All right, another common fallacy is this is kind of similar to whataboutism, is the red herring, which is a reference to a fish. The red herring is very common in political and online discourse. This is the deliberate raising of an irrelevant issue during an argument, or an attempt to divert attention away from the main argument in question, right? So, for example, let's say somebody says, there is a good deal of talk about the need to eliminate pesticides or chemicals in our food system, but many of those foods provide essential nutrients. So what's going on here? Well, the issue is whether we should eliminate pesticides in food. The issue is not whether the food provides essential nutrients. I don't think anybody's denying that, right? But see, this move is to take us away from talking about pesticides and to talking about nutrition, right? So while they might be related, this is an irrelevant issue to whether or not we should stop using pesticides in certain foods, right? So people do this all the time, especially to divert attention away from the main topic at hand and onto something else to either confuse or distract. It's a very common move used in argumentation, especially in politics and, as I said, online discourse. Here's another common one, straw man. When we straw man somebody, what we're doing is we're distorting, weakening, or oversimplifying someone else's position so it looks weak and it can be more easily attacked or refuted. So let's say I'm a senator in the US Senate and I oppose some military spending bill for some reason, right? Potentially saying it's too costly. But then somebody says, oh, well, you must hate the troops, or you must hate the armed services, right? Or you say, why does Anthony always want to slash everything to the bone? He wants a pint-sized military that couldn't fight off a crazed band of terrorists, let alone a rogue nation. This person is strawmanning my position, right? So let's say I made an argument for, people taking the bus to campus. And then somebody says, oh, well, Professor Ferrucci wants to take away everybody's car. Well, that's not what I said, right? What I said was we should incentivize people to take the bus or ride a bike to campus. I didn't say that we should get rid of all cars, right? So someone is strawmanning me there. They're putting up a fake version of you so that they can make me look bad and refute the position more easily. Very common one, two wrongs make a right. People use this kind of reasoning all the time. Maybe you have, I'm sure I have. This is the case where we argue that some action is justified or morally right because someone else has done the same or similar thing. I mean, whether it's stealing a laptop because somebody else stole it, or let's say I walked into a grocery store and I steal a really expensive bottle of scotch from the cabinet at Safeway. And then the police show up and they say, did you do this? And then I said, well, what's the big deal? I see people do it all the time. Is that going to work in a court? No, right? We don't let that reasoning stand there. So we really shouldn't let it stand in everyday discourse either. All right, so the category 2 fallacies are the fallacies with unacceptable premises. So the first one is begging the question. This is a very common one, also with conspiracy theorists. This is often referred to as circular reasoning, and this occurs whenever the arguer uses a conclusion as a premise, and then the premise as the conclusion. So if I made an argument for, say, some monster that exists out there, let's call it the flying spaghetti monster. And I say, look, the flying spaghetti monster exists. We know that they exist because the cookbook, which is my cookbook, says so, and we should believe what the cookbook says because the flying spaghetti monster wrote it. See how I'm using the conclusion as the premise and the premise is the conclusion? I'm arguing in a circle here, right? I'm not independently establishing the truth of the premise, which I should be doing. I'm just simply using or restating the conclusion as the premise and the premise is the conclusion. False dilemma, another common one. This is a disjunctive statement, which we should already be familiar with, where we present only two alternatives when there's potentially many more than just two. So we use this in political discourse. Look, either you support the war or you support terrorism, right? You don't support the war, so you must support terrorism. That's a clear false dilemma, right? Those aren't the only two choices. There's also, this comes in varieties. One version of it that's quite common, I think, is what's called the perfectionist fallacy or the perfectionist false dilemma. And maybe your parents say stuff like this or family members, like, hey, either go to Harvard or don't bother going to college at all, right? I mean, that's a perfectionist fallacy. It's also used, I think, in context about laws. I certainly know people who make arguments like this, that we shouldn't pass certain laws because people will just not follow them. But I mean, people don't follow all kinds of laws. That's not a good reason to get rid of them, right? So sometimes people use this in the gun control debate or some other debate where they say, look, people are just going to break those laws. Well, people break the law about driving under the influence. It doesn't mean we should abolish the law because some people drive drunk, right? So it's not good reasoning to present only two choices when there are more than two, right? But it's very common for people to do that. So we need to be on alert for that. Decision point fallacy, not as common. The book's example works fine. This is arguing that because a line or distinction cannot be drawn at any point in a process, that there are no differences or gradations in that process, right? So as Joe loses his hair, there's no point at which we can definitively say that Joe became bald. Therefore, Joe is not going bald. Or people use this with income, right? You might say, well, because there's no clear demarcation between rich and poor, and this person has X amount of money, therefore they're not rich, right? Well, yeah, it might not be $1, but clearly there is a gradation or a spectrum of wealth, right? So just because we can't draw a clear line between, right, certain classes doesn't mean there is no gradation, right? So this is called the decision point fallacy. Slippery slope, very common one used in arguments about legalizing certain drugs, especially marijuana, or gay marriage is another good example. This fallacy occurs when the conclusion of an argument rests on an alleged chain reaction for which there is insufficient reason to think will actually take place. So we've heard various arguments against legalizing marijuana. One might be something like, we absolutely must reject the argument for legalized marijuana. If we accept that argument, then we'll be forced to accept legalized cocaine. And before you know it, they'll be passing out hard drugs in elementary schools, right? That's clearly a slippery slope. Washington's had legalized marijuana for what, 8 years or so now, and I don't think they're passing out hard drugs in elementary schools, right? So that would be a slippery slope fallacy. Hasty generalization. We've talked about this briefly in chapter 2. This is where we argue that a whole group has some characteristic based on an insufficient sample size and usually relying on stereotypes and anecdotal experience. So for example, if I said philosophy majors are incredibly ignorant about everything, believe me, my roommate in college was a philosophy major, and let me tell you, he was the worst, right? We're arguing from an insufficient non-representative sample size to a target group, right, with insufficient evidence. We generalize without sufficient evidence. Okay, and lastly, the category 3, the rhetorical devices. Hopefully a lot of these should be familiar. We also call these persuaders. So a rhetorical device is a piece of non-argumentative language that employs usually emotive words and phrases intended to persuade or influence an audience. Whereas arguments try to persuade through logic and reasons, rhetorical devices employ emotion-laden language instead of giving reasons. So the book mentions an actual very famous case. This is the late senator from Arizona, John McCain. The book mentions, I believe, a case of about 20 years ago in 2000 when John McCain was running for president against George W. Bush in the Republican primary. And they were making calls to voters, the Bush campaign, and they would ask very loaded questions that seemed to suggest things without explicitly stating it. So a question I think was like, how likely are you to vote for Senator McCain if you knew that he fathered an illegitimate child of color? Now, if you heard that question, right? I mean, they're not explicitly saying that he's fathered an illegitimate child of color, but they're insinuating it, right? They're suggesting it without explicitly saying it. So that's whenever we do things like that, we're employing innuendo. Innuendo is used, all the time, especially in when we're trying to make somebody else look bad. So another example might be, I'm fairly certain that Professor Proton's youthful indiscretions involving crack cocaine, money laundering, and gambling have no influence on his current ability to teach his classes. So what's going on here? The fact that I'm bringing up these things, I'm almost being sarcastic, right? But I'm suggesting or denigrating Professor Proton by invoking these things, right? I'm suggesting that they might have an ability on them to teach their class, even though I don't explicitly say so. So whenever we do things like that, that's innuendo. We're suggesting something without explicitly stating it. Euphemisms and dysphemisms, very common. These are words in any language. And euphemisms are used to convey positive or neutral attitudes or emotions, often to make them sound better than they actually are, right? So when we say things are full-figured, passed on or away, collateral damage, right, for innocent civilians who might be killed in a war zone, put to sleep instead of killed, letting someone go instead of dumping them or breaking up with them, relocation center instead of internment camp, right? Breaking wind is, I think, a good example of a euphemism. Freedom fighter versus a terrorist, or one of my favorites, enhanced interrogation instead of torture, right? Torture sounds really bad, but if you call it enhanced interrogation, it sounds a lot better. Whereas dysphemisms are words used to convey negative attitudes or emotions, often to make them sound worse than they actually are. So when people call people illegal aliens, that makes, instead of migrant workers, right, that makes them sound much worse. We also have a way of using speciesist language. When we call people things like gorillas or pigs, right, those are usually dysphemisms. Assault weapons versus automatic weapons, right? Terrorist, nut house, there's lots of examples, but we often use words to convey either positive or more negative attitudes to the listener. We've already talked about stereotyping. I like this meme. But in previous chapter, right, the use of an unwarranted conclusion or generalization, it's related to hasty generalization, but in stereotype, it's usually, it's not so much anecdotal, but just drawing an inference about a whole group of people, right? And it happens on all sides, right? Whether we're stereotyping all Southerners or all Democrats, or, right, we're drawing we're using fallacious reasoning to make certain inferences. Right, here's a good stereotype. We know that all Italian Americans have ties to the mafia, right? That's a stereotype, but clearly false. Ridicule, sarcasm. This is just the use of derision, sarcasm, laughter, or mockery to disparage a person or idea without even considering it, right? So for example, you argue that we should take a philosophy class. Haha, what a seriously stupid idea. Shut up, Anthony, right? I mean, that's pretty obvious case of it, but without even considering the idea, someone just tells me to shut up, right? That wouldn't be very good reasoning. We also do this a lot, rhetorical definitions. This is when we attempt to inaccurately define something to make it seem less acceptable or attractive. So if we said, gun control is code for getting rid of everyone's gun. Well, that's not what gun control is, right? But it's often defined that way. Or tax reform is just another name for giving every extra cent to billionaires. Or environmentalism is the view that eating meat should be illegal, right? Well, that's not really what environmentalism is. One of my favorites also is feminism. Feminism usually gets defined rather negatively and rhetorically quite often. So I've heard people say things like feminism is the view that men don't matter, or that women are better than men, right? That's not the definition of any feminist I've read, right? And I don't think that should be taken as the standard definition of feminism. People define things all the time that they don't like to make it seem less attractive, right? So this is called rhetorical definitions. Okay, so if you're interested in doing a little practice, you can feel free to pause the video here, and I will give the answers. So number one is a rhetorical definition, right? Pretty clearly. Number two is the genetic fallacy. Number three is appeal to ignorance. This is a good one. This is, I want to have myself a merry little Christmas, but I refuse to do as the song suggests and make the Yuletide gay. I don't think sexual preference should have anything to do with enjoying the holiday. That's equivocation because I'm using gay in two different senses here. Appeal to emotion. This is circular reasoning, right? Begging the question. And this is appeal to tradition, number 7. So let me leave it there. I know I've gone over a lot, but if you have any questions, please be sure to let me know. And hopefully you enjoyed thinking about these very common fallacies.